Hello, how are yous? My name's Keenan. I'm going to tell a few stories on behalf of the World Storytelling Cafe. I'm going to tell a few stories for children first of all. One of my favourites is the story of Sean and the leprechauns. Now, just in case you don't know what a leprechaun is, over here in Ireland we have many fairy folk. And the leprechaun is well known for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're quite small. In fact, the largest ever recorded, I believe, was no more than 3 feet high. And he was a giant. They usually wear a wee green hat and a wee green coat. They like to smoke and they love to make shoes. The shoes they made are called brogues. If you ever get a pair of leprechaun brogues, you're a lucky man or woman, for they will last you the whole of your life. They'll never wear out and they're as light as anything. In fact, they make you so light on your feet you will become like a dancer. Well, leprechauns have their pot of gold, and many a one would go chasing after the pot of gold. Not everyone has ever been able to catch a leprechaun. And by the way, if you do catch a leprechaun, you do not blink or look away for 1 iota, or the leprechaun will be gone. So anyway, this man Sean, he was a farmer. Now, he wasn't a great farmer. In fact, he was quite lazy. He was always looking for the leprechaun. Instead of looking after the farm, he'd be running about here, there and everywhere. He'd be going to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, trying to find a leprechaun and the pot of gold. They never did. And the farm was going to rack and ruin, and he never married and he never had a family, and he didn't have much to do at all with his life. So the day came when a friend took him aside and said, "Sean, I have to tell you something." Sean was very intrigued. "Well, what do you want to tell me?" "Sean, you're still chasing the leprechauns." I am. And when I find one, I'll get a pot of gold and I'll be rich and I won't have to do a hand's turn." "Sean," said his friend, "I've something to tell you." "Oh," Sean said, "now don't you dare tell me there's no such a thing as a leprechaun, because I know there is." "Oh, it's not that, Sean. The thing is that we're the big people, and the leprechauns have no love of us. Indeed, they have got great hearing, and if they hear one of the big people in the vicinity, they will disappear just like that. But I can teach you something." And Sean said, please do, what do you want to teach me?" And his friend said, "Here's the thing. You have to learn to walk quietly. So quietly that if you were going down a lane and there was a mouse in the middle of the lane, you could walk by it and not disturb it. Not only have you to walk quietly, you have to walk gently on the earth, so that if you went through a field in the morning, you would not disturb 1 drop of dew on 1 single blade of grass." Sean was amazed at this. He'd never heard anything like this before. He took it seriously, and within a matter of months, he became the quietest walker in the whole of Ireland. And he walked upon the earth so gently that he never ever knocked over a blade of grass. And sure enough, on one of his days when he was out walking, just as the sun was setting, he heard the sound of a leprechaun. Tap, 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 tap. for the leprechaun was making a pair of shoes. Sean bent down and looked through a hedge, and there, in the beautiful dusk of evening, was a leprechaun bent over making his shoes. Sean reached in so quietly through that hedge. "Gotcha! Ha ha!" he said, "I gotcha!" And he held the leprechaun in his hand, and the wee leprechaun looked at him and said, "You big, ignorant big person. Yous are all the same horrible, horrible people. There's me just sitting there making a pair of shoes for a friend, and you come along and grab the hold of me. Who do you think you are, you big, ignorant blurt?" Sean shook him and said, "Stop your blithering. Now, tell me." And the leprechaun looked, and he had this expression on his face saying, "Oh, why is it always like this?" "I know what you're going to say," said the leprechaun. "Where's your pot of gold?" "Well, the pot of gold is at the end of the rainbow. Did you not know that?" And Sean said, "No, I don't believe that." And the leprechaun laughed and said, "Well, true, we keep it buried underneath the ground. But we have so much fun watching you big people chase after rainbows." And Sean said, "Now don't be distracting me. Tell me, where is your pot of gold?" And the leprechaun said, "Well, you've got the hold of me, you haven't looked away from me. That's the rules, I'll have to tell you. We'll have to go into the field with the wee bushes." So they went into the field with the wee bushes. And indeed it was a field. And it was filled with wee bushes. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It was getting quite dark. And Sean couldn't see where he was going exactly. But the leprechaun knew where he was going. And the leprechaun said to Sean, "Right here. This is where my pot of gold is hidden. Underneath that wee bush." "But you've a problem," said the leprechaun. "You see, it's buried 4 feet underground. And you don't have a shovel." Sean said, "That's a very, very keen observation. Yes, I'm going to have to go and get a shovel. If I go and get a shovel, will you promise not to move the gold?" The leprechaun smiled and said, "I promise not to move the pot of gold." And Sean said, "Well, you've been very decent. And this is the very spot where the gold is buried?" "Yes, it is indeed." "Great." So Sean took up his wee scarf and he tied it around the bottom of the bush where the gold was buried. And he let the leprechaun go and said, "Take care now, away you go," and the leprechaun vanished just like that. Sean went home, and even though it was dark, he came back. He had his shovel and he had a lamp, and he came into the field of the wee bushes to find that scarf of his. But as soon as he got there, he looked around, and every single bush had a scarf tied around it. Oh, he knew he'd been well and truly defeated by that wee leprechaun. He knew he'd never get his pot of gold. But what he did do next was really interesting. What he did was to go around the field, and he picked up the scarves that was tied around every one of those wee bushes. In fact, there were over 800 of them. And he brought them home and he made sure they were all cleaned and ironed. And then he took them to the fair at Ballycastle, the Old Lammas Fair. And at the Old Lammas Fair, he sold every single one of them, and for a pretty penny, they were the most beautifully made items. Sean made a few pounds out of that. And believe it or not, he met a young woman. The two of them got on very well, and she encouraged him to look after the farm. and the farm did well. And Sean would go out every now and again, and any time he heard the sound of the leprechaun, he would stop, he would sit down, he would introduce himself, and he would say, "How's the family? How are you doing? And would you like a wee smoke?" And so a conversation started, and Sean became known as a friend of the leprechauns. Sean prospered, and Sean had friends and a family. And sure, isn't having friends and a family worth more than a pot of gold? Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. I certainly enjoyed telling it. Now here in Belfast we've got a tradition of playing, and children would go out and play on the streets. This was before all the cars, and they used to play games like Marley's Marbles and skipping games. And one of the songs that they used to sing, well, it was more of a rhyme than a song, was called Skinnamalink. So I'd like to teach you Skinnamalink. It's quite short, and I'll just tell it, and then I'll do it slowly, so you can pick up the words yourself, and you possibly will be able to sing it or rhyme it to yourself in the future. It's just a bit of fun. Skinnamalink Melodian had big banana feet, went to the doctors and couldn't get a seat. When he got a seat, he fell fast asleep. Skinnamalink Melodian had big banana feet. Right, I'll do it slowly this time. Skinnamalink Melodian head, big banana feet, went to the doctors and couldn't get a seat. But when he got a seat, he fell fast asleep. Skinnamalink Melodian head, big banana feet. So there you go. There's a wee rhyme or a poem or a song or whatever you want to call it for yourselves. And I hope you learn it and sing it whenever you want. Now, there was a land far away from here, and that land was covered in mountains. And on the side of one of those mountains there was a small collection of houses, and in one of those houses there was a young boy, and he was very, very sad and very unhappy. You see, where he lived was a lonely place, but it was worse than that. Where he lived was a place on the side of the mountain, and the wind would blow harsh and cold, and in the winter the snow would fall deep. There was very little wood to be had, and so everyone was cold in the winter. But at least with the snow there was water to be had. But when the snow melted, the only water they could get was from a shallow well, and that water tasted brackish and harsh. But that wasn't the worst of it. I said he was a lonely child. He was the only child in that small place, that little collection of houses that was too small to be called a village or a hamlet. He was the only child. He had no friends. And he wanted friends. He wanted adventures. He wanted to be able to play and do things and go places. No, he was stuck on the side of the mountain. And that wasn't the worst of it. Because they were on the side of the mountain, the soil was very thin. And as the soil was very thin, well, they couldn't grow much. And so anything they tried to grow, like potatoes or carrots or cabbages, they didn't thrive, they didn't do well. So there was never enough food. And the poor cows and the sheep and the pigs, well, there was not enough grass for them in the soil. And the poor wee pigs, well, I mean, there wasn't anything left over after dinner, so they were always hungry. I'll tell you something. Now you can come to Ireland, and you can go to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, and you'll never see a skinny pig. But on the side of the mountain, that's where skinny pigs lived. And they were not happy. And the poor cow, because there wasn't enough grass, the milk that it gave was almost watery. And you couldn't make cheese or yogurt out of it. But that wasn't the worst of it. You see, on the other side of the mountain where they lived, there was a wide valley. And in that valley, the people were happy. There were lots of children, and there were lots of people having fun. The children could play in the forests, and they could run through the fields, and the fields were deep with thick, green, lush grass. And the pigs and the cows and the sheep who lived there were all well fed and happy. In fact, the pigs were so happy, they would dream about becoming ham shanks, sausages, and such like. And through the village that was in that valley, there was a stream. And that stream had water. That water was so sweet to taste, so delicious to drink, that if you drank it before you went to bed, it would make you laugh in your dreams. Well, you might question, why did the people who lived up on the side of the mountain not come down and live in that valley? They would have been made more than welcome. There was lots of room, and people were kind and happy. And this is where I get to the worst of the problem. You see, in that land, with all those mountains, at the top of some of the mountains, there were monsters. And indeed, on that mountain where those people lived, there was indeed a monster. If anyone went up the mountain path to go into that beautiful valley, the monster would come down, and the monster roared and howled and screeched. There was thunder crashing and lightning flashing, and not even the bravest man would go up that mountain path. If they did, they would wet their pants in fear. And the dreadful thing was, the mountain path was the only way away from that place on the side of the mountain. And that is why no one ever left. And there came a day when the young man, for he had grown up now, this lonely child, was getting to the age where he needed to go away. He needed to do things. He needed to find people he could have friendships with. He needed to be able to travel the world. And he needed to stop being frightened of the monster and always being cold and always hungry. He got himself really worked up about it one day, and he decided, there's no point in me living here in this dreadful place. I'm going to face the monster. I shall be strong of mind and brave of heart. What is the point of living a life where you can never be happy and always fearful? So that very day, the young man walked up the mountain path, and sure enough, as soon as he put his foot on that mountain path, the monster came down. And the monster howled and screamed and roared, and the lightning flashed and the thunder crashed. But he kept on walking. He kept on walking. He kept on walking, and the monster became nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer, until it was as close to him as I am to you now. And the monster roared again. And the young man did the bravest thing he'd ever done in his life. He took one more step. And with that step, everything changed. It was the monster that stopped. And the monster started to go back with every step forward the young man took. And as the young man started walking quicker and quicker up that mountain path, the monster retreated and became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And as it became smaller and smaller and smaller, the lightning stopped and the thunder stopped and the roaring and howling was no more. And the young man came up to where the monster was, and all that was there was a small pebble. A pebble that size. And he looked at it and said, "What are you?" And a tiny voice came from the pebble. "I am fear." And the voice said, "I do not fear you." He threw the pebble over the side of the mountain and smashed it into pieces, and then he went back down the mountain path, back to that place where he lived, and he told everyone what had happened. At first they didn't believe him, but in the morning when they looked up to the top of the mountain, and they saw that there was no monster. And so that day they took all their belongings, all their bags and baggages, and they went over the mountain path down into that beautiful valley where the grass is green and lush, and where the water is so beautiful to taste it would make you laugh in your dreams. And that's where they lived, happily ever after. Now I'd like to tell you a story about another type of child. Now, this child was a very disobedient child. And this child was a little girl who lived with her mother in the middle of a great forest. They lived in this small village. And unlike the young boy in the previous story, there were lots of children, and unfortunately that little girl was very disobedient, very disrespectful, and quite willful. So she didn't have very many friends. In fact, her mother was slightly annoyed with her. You see, she was very, very, very disobedient, much more disobedient than any other child. I'm sure if you're a child and you are listening to this story, you would never do some of the things that this child did. For example, if her mother ever said, "Dearest darling daughter, would you please go to the shops and get us a loaf of bread so that we can have something for supper tonight?" Well, the little girl would look at her mother, and she'd give that look, shaking the head. She'd fold her arms, and she'd stamp her feet, and she'd say, "No way! Go yourself." If her mother ever said, "Dearest darling daughter dear, your room is absolutely a mess. Would you please tidy up your room?" And her daughter looked at her and gave her that look, shook her head, folded her arms, stamped her foot, and said, "My room, my mess. I'll tidy it whenever I want to, and not when you tell me. So there." If her mother ever said, "Dearest darling daughter dear, it is getting very late. Would you please come in? After all, it is getting dark, and you know we live in the middle of the forest, and the forest has creatures living in it. Creatures that would mean harm to you. The little girl shook the head, looked at her mammy, folded her arms, stamped her foot and said, "I'll come in whenever I want and not when you tell me. So there." Strange thing was, mammy just looked at her and said, "One day, child, you will learn. You will learn, and it will be a harsh lesson." And that day came. The little girl was standing outside her house, looking up and down to see if there was anything happening. And her friend, her only friend, came running up. "You will not believe the biz. You will not believe what I have just heard." "What did you just hear?" "You will not believe it." "What did you just hear?" "You will not believe it." "Seriously? Tell me." "Well, you know beside your house is a wee lane goes down off into the forest?" "Yes, yes, yes." "You know just about half a mile down there, on the bend in the road, there's an old ruined cottage?" "Yes, yes, yes." "It's no longer ruined. It's been fixed up. There's someone living in it." "Someone living in the old ruined cottage?" "Yes." "A witch." "Oh, fantastic," said the little girl. "Maybe we should go down and find out if the witch will tell us how to do terrible things to all those nice children who do always what their mummies and daddies tell them." And her friend looked at her and went, "Yeah, well, that sounds interesting, but really I've got places to go, people to see. I'll see you later. Bye." And off she went. The little girl went back inside her house, and her mother was standing there, and her mother had a very serious look on her face, and she said, "Dearest darling daughter dear, do not go near that creature in the woods. That creature, I know of her. She is evil. She hates children and would mean only harm to anyone who she met." Well, the little girl looked at her mammy, shook her head, put on that face, folded her arms, stamped her foot and said, "Whatever." Well, that night the little girl waited until her mummy went to bed, and as soon as she knew her mummy was fast asleep, she got up. She went down the steps, out of the house, down that dark lane. It was dark and cold, and the moon bounced over the clouds. The wind blew through the trees, and it was almost as if the trees were saying, "Go back, child, go back." She wasn't interested. She saw a light, a very strange light, where the cottage was, and she walked up to the cottage and she looked in, and there was this horrible old crone. And it wasn't the fact that it was an old crone that terrified the girl. Oh no. It wasn't the fact that there was a witch's broom and there was a witch's hat. No, no, no. What terrified her was the green flames coming out of the witch's mouth and eyes and ears as she stirred this pot of horrible gloopy green stuff. And no sooner had the child seen the witch saw the child and said, "Child, come now into my home. You will now come, you will do as you are told." And for the first time in her life, the child had indeed to do as she was told. And she walked into the house even though she was screaming inside with fear and didn't want to go into that house. The witch made her come into the house by casting a spell on her. And as the witch looked her up and down, she said, "Children. I hate children." And there in the door was this most beautiful creature. A creature of power, of beauty, exuding love and strength. And the creature looked at this apparition in the doorway with fear. And the beautiful creature said, "Step away from that child. You will no longer harm children. You will no longer have any say in the future of a life of anyone. You have met your doom." just like that, the witch was turned into a block of wood, and I believe she burnt very well. The young girl, awake from her spell, looked around, and there she saw her mother. And her mother looked at her and said, "Well, child, I don't suppose you're going to be bold or willful or disobedient again, will you?" "No, Mummy," said the wee girl. "No, no, no. I'll be good from now on." And indeed she was. So remember, children, whatever you do in life, always honour, respect and love your mother, the one who brought you into this world, or you never know what could happen. Thank you. Well, I've got one final wee story, but this concerns another witch, but it concerns a witch who's a very, very good witch. Winnie the Witch. And if you haven't read the book, look it out. Winnie the Witch. She's a wonderful character. Very eccentric. Extremely eccentric, actually. You see, Winnie the Witch loves the colour black. Everything she wears is black. Her hat is black. Her cloak is black. Her socks are black. But it's not just what she wears that is black. No, no, no. Everything in the house that she lives in is black. The curtains are black. The ceilings are black. All the furniture is black. All the chairs, black. The toilet, black. The sink, black. Everything is black, including her cat. Her cat is a big and beautiful cat. He's very big, very hairy, and he has big, big green eyes. Now, when he comes into the house, he likes to sit on Winnie's favourite seat. And sometimes he'll fall asleep. This results in an occasion of unhappiness. For sometimes Winnie will come in from doing the shopping and she will sit down on her favourite seat. She sat on the cat. The cat wasn't happy and neither was Winnie. But they loved each other, they were friends, and they made up. But one day things changed. Winnie was waiting for the Witches' Weekly. Now, some of you will know that the Witches' Weekly has all the news of the goings on in the world of witches. And Winnie was so excited because in that week's Witches' Weekly there was a spell that she had created herself. Oh yes, she had created it. Yes, it was a spell to stir porridge without a spoon or spurtle. Don't try this at home unless you know the spell. It's very dangerous to do. Winnie was so excited to see that her spell would be in the newspaper, as she sat on her favourite chair, waiting and waiting. And then there was a rattle at the door. The Witches' Weekly had arrived. She went running down the stairs, and halfway down the stairs she tripped over something that was big and black and fairy. It was indeed the cat. Poor Winnie. She went flying head over heels down to the bottom of the stairs, and when she landed at the bottom of the stairs on her bottom, she was not a happy witch. She lost her temper. She took out her wand and she screamed at the cat, "Wilbur!" For that indeed was his name. "Wilbur! That will never happen again. I'll teach you a lesson you'll not forget." And she went swish and swish and swish and swish. And Wilbur was no longer a big black cat. No, He was multicoloured. His tummy was pink. His nose was orange. His ears were purple. His bum was blue. His back was stripy green and yellow. He looked at himself in absolute horror and ran out of the house. Oh, and things got worse then. All the mice that Wilbur used to chase around the house, well, they came out and they started to laugh at Wilbur the cat in the most mousy way. Oh, he was so embarrassed. He went down to the bottom of the garden, and at the bottom of the garden there was a tree where the birds that Wilbur used to chase would sit and roost. And they saw Wilbur and they flew round and round and round him, and they all laughed in a birdie cheepy sort of way. They cheeped. "You're not so good looking now, are you?" Oh, poor Wilbur was so embarrassed. He cried and he cried and he cried. Well, Winnie inside the house had sat down, or she regained her composure, and she was no longer angry at Wilbur the cat. Indeed, she knew that she'd really upset her best friend. I'll have to find a solution to this. And within a few minutes, she had a brainwave. She went outside and she called Wilbur the cat over, and Wilbur came over, poor wee man. Ugh, his wee head down. When he said, "Wilbur, I'm sorry I lost my temper with you. I shouldn't have done. But we're going to make this right." She took out her wand, and with one wave, Wilbur was back to being himself, a big, black, furry cat, and he was happy. And so off he went. He went off chasing after those pesky birds and those pesky mice. Winnie went into the house, and in each room she took out her wand and went swish, swish, swish. So now each room is multicoloured. White ceilings, pink wallpaper, white toilet, a multicoloured rainbow chair to sit in, and so on and so on. And so whenever Wilbur comes in and falls asleep anywhere, Winnie can see him. She doesn't want him to change because she loves him the way he is. And that's where they lived, happily ever after. But they had many, many more adventures, so please try and look out the books of Winnie the Witch. Won't be a wasted journey. Here's the story of Marjorie McCall. Not too far from where I live in Belfast, there is a town called Lurgan. It's in County Armagh. And in the town of Lurgan there's a graveyard. The name of that graveyard is Shankill Graveyard. Shankill Graveyard, Lurgan. And in that graveyard there's a grave. And on that grave it says, Marjorie McCall, lived once, buried twice. And this is the way of it. About 250 years ago, Lurgan was doing great. There was work to be had, money to be made, industry was rising. And in that town lived a young man whose name was John McCall. John McCall was very well respected. He was a hard-working, honest young man who worked hard, and he was doing very well for himself. One day John met Marjorie. As soon as they got talking to each other, they realised that they were just so perfect for each other. They enjoyed the same sort of things, they laughed at the same sort of things, and they could argue with each other without any harshness or cruelty. And they valued the same things. They fell deeply in love. And it was no surprise at all for Marjorie whenever John asked asked for her hand in marriage. She gladly accepted, and they went up to the big town and got a beautiful ring. Now, this ring was so perfectly made, so well made and encrusted with jewels and so on. It was the talk of the town. Marjorie and he were so happy when they got married and moved into their own wee house, and like all couples, they learnt to live together, and within a few years the children came along. Everything was going well, and John was working hard and doing well, and Marjorie loved nothing better than looking after him and looking after the house and looking after the children. There was one problem. Every so often Marjorie would fall ill, and this illness was like a weakening, a wasting, and she was so weak she could hardly lift her own hand. Well, she recovered, and John would look after her, and they just got on with things. But then one day John came home and he found her lying on the floor, cold and still. He shook her, but she did not respond. They sent for the doctor, and the doctor came, and now you have to remember, this was maybe 250 years ago. The doctor came and tried to find a pulse, and there was no pulse. Tried to find a heartbeat, and there was no heartbeat. He took out a little mirror and put it against the lips of Marjorie McCall. He hoped to see condensation, which would indicate breathing, but there was none. "Oh, John," he said, "I'm so sorry. I have to declare that your wife is deceased." Just like we do now. There was to be a funeral, but before the funeral there was the wake. And that meant that the house had to be cleaned, the front room done up, the curtains pulled across, the clocks put out of the way, and the mirrors turned to the wall. And the coffin was brought in, and Marjorie was lying in her coffin, in a white shift, with her hands across her chest. People came in and expressed their sorrow and distress, offered prayers. People sat and talked and were grieved at the family's loss. But it was the time for the funeral. So they lifted the coffin lid, and just as they were lifting the coffin lid, the voice came from the back of the room. "Oh, John, what about the ring? You're not leaving it on her finger, are you?" John turned round. He was outraged. "Of course that ring shall stay on her finger. I bought her that as a sign of our love and affection for each other. It will stay with her." So they secured the coffin lid and went down to the graveyard. And there was the empty grave. The coffin was lifted into it, and the clods of earth put on top. The prayers were said, and everyone went home. John sat in his house with the two children, trying to console them as they tried to console him. But that night, a man with evil intent came into the graveyard and found Marjorie's grave and began to dig. And he dug and he dug and he dug and he dug until he came down to the coffin. And when he came to the coffin, he took hold of the spade and put it underneath the lid of the coffin. Crack! The coffin lid broke. There was Marjorie McCall, lying still and cold in death, in her own coffin, in her own grave. The man reached out roughly for her hand and tried to tug that ring off her finger. It wouldn't come. So he reached into a pocket and pulled out a sharp knife, and that sharp knife he used to cut through the flesh of her finger. And no sooner had he cut through the flesh than with a scream, Marjorie McCall leapt up and screamed into his face. Marjorie McCall back from the dead. The man was so terrified, he got up, he jumped out of that coffin, he jumped out of that grave and ran into the dark of night and was never seen or heard of again. Marjorie McCall climbed out of her own grave, went home, knocked on the door, and she always knocked the same way. Her husband inside said, "Children, if I didn't know better, I'd say it was your mother." They all went to the door and opened the door, and there was Marjorie McCall, back from the dead. Mud and clobber covering her white shift, blood dripping from her finger. The children didn't mind or care. All they knew was that their mother was back, and they hugged her and squeezed her and laughed and cried with joy. John fainted. They sent for the big doctor, and the big doctor was able to tell them that she had an illness called narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is where your breathing almost stops. Your breath is so faded, so infrequent. Your heartbeat almost stops, and it can't be felt. And your pulse, no, too light, too infrequent. Now, we don't have to worry about that sort of thing now, because we've got all this technology that can identify whether a person is alive or dead. But in those days it was different. In those days narcolepsy was known about, and sometimes when people were buried, they would pay people to watch over the grave for a couple of days. And sometimes people would have a piece of string tied around their hand that would go through a hole in the side of the coffin and up to the grave, where the gravestone was, and where the gravestone was, there was a bell. So if anybody woke up from death, all they had to do was hold their hand like that, and the bell would ring. That's where the phrase "dead ringer" comes from. Well, Marjorie McCall lived a long life. She lived into her 80s. She actually outlived her first husband, married again, and had a third child. She's buried with her second husband. Now, that's a true story. Marjorie McCall lived once and buried twice. And if you don't believe it, just go onto the internet and type in Shankill Graveyard Lurgan onto Google or whatever it is, and you'll find the story there for yourself. Thank you. There once was a man who lived in a very, very hot country. Every day he would go down from the village and he would walk to the stream. When he got to the stream, he would put down 2 pots that would hold water. One was so beautiful, so well made, and the other was cracked. They were both attached onto a yoke across the man's back, so when he filled them up and walked back to his home, the perfect pot did not spill 1 drop of water, where the cracked pot dripped and dripped all the way back. And when he got back to the house, it was half empty. Now, in those ancient days, magic happened. And the wee pot, the poor cracked pot, looked at the master and said, "Master, I am so ashamed that I have not been a good pot, that I am cracked. and drip water. And the man looked and smiled and said, "Oh no, no, I love you the way you are. You see, when I fill you up and walk along the road, your water drips down, and it is along the side of the road that I have planted and thrown seeds of beautiful flowers. And the water enables those flowers to grow. And I pick those flowers that are so beautiful and put them on the table. And those flowers brighten my life. So don't you worry if you are a cracked pot. We're all special in our own way." I'm almost at the end of the storytelling now. And I suppose in a way I have to tell a story about, well, about these difficult times. It's an old traveller story. The people sat around the fire in the forest. Some talked to each other and some did not. And as they listened in the dark of night, they heard a fluttering, the fluttering of wings. And through the trees came an owl, shining silver, silent. And then the owl called out and said, "Death is coming, death is coming, death is coming." And the people were terrified. The people got up, and some ran away to the highlands, and some went to the lowlands, and some went to the burned out church. But death did not come that day or the next. So when the people gathered together again, they sat around the fire again and talked about the strange call of the owl. And then the owl came back and called out again that death was coming. And some people, realizing that this was true, they turned round and talked to their friends. And people who'd fell out hugged and renewed their friendships. And then there was singing. And then there was laughter. On the third night, the owl came back and called out again, "Death is coming!" And some people who didn't understand, they threw sticks and stones at the owl to chase it away. "Be gone, be gone! Death has not come." But those who were wise, they knew the message. Yes, death is coming. Maybe not tomorrow or the day after, but it will come. And maybe in the early morning or late at night. It will come. But joy, peace, and love are already here and can be shared. There once was an island, and on that island there lived all the feelings that ever were. There was joy, there was sadness, there was anger, vanity, all sorts of feelings. And particularly love. But one day an announcement was made that the island was sinking. Indeed, shortly it would go to the bottom of the ocean. All those emotions were very distressed at this. Especially love, for she loved that island and cared for it. But the feelings started making little boats and sailing away. But some held on. And love held on because she was always hopeful. But the day came when there was no doubt about it. This was the day the island would sink. And so love looked around to see if there was anyone who would take her away. And she saw Vanity. And Vanity was in her beautiful boat. And she called out to Vanity, "Vanity, please, will you take me with you?" And Vanity looked at Love down her nose and said, "You are wet and you're not clean, and I have the most beautiful boat, and I don't want my boat ruined. You would mess it up. I can't take you, Love." Vanity sailed away. And then came Riches. And Riches, Love called out, "Riches, would you take me with you?" Riches turned round and looked at Love and said, "My boat is filled with precious jewels, gold and silver. They are important to me. I have no room for you." And then Love saw Sadness. Sadness was crying and weeping and, distraught. Love called out, "Sadness, will you take me with you?" And Sadness said, "I cannot take you with me. I am so distraught, I need to be alone." Sadness sailed away. And then Happiness came by. And Happiness was so delighted at leaving the island and being safe that Happiness laughed and laughed and laughed and did not hear Love's call. And then a little boat came along, and there was an ancient one in it. And the ancient one called out, "Love, you come with me. I will look after you." And Love thanked the ancient one, got in the boat, and she was so happy that she was sailing away to a new place. When they got to the shore, she got out of the boat and the ancient one had disappeared. And Love was all annoyed because she wanted to say thank you to the one who'd rescued her. She was very confused. Who was it? But then knowledge came. And knowledge told Love that was time. You see, only time knows how precious love truly is. Well, that's the end of my stories. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you did enjoy them, don't forget there is this thing, the hat, and if you want to throw a few shekels or euros or whatever into it, I'd be very grateful. But whatever, I hope you enjoyed the stories. That's more important to me. And isn't it great to be part of something wonderful, this World's Storytelling Cafe. Look forward to hearing more wonderful stories from all those fantastic storytellers. So take care and have a lovely day. Thank you. This is a story about a willful child, a very naughty child, a very disrespectful child. This child lived in a land far away. She lived with her mother in this forest. For in the middle of the forest there was a small village. This little girl was extremely cheeky, naughty and rude. I'll just tell you how bad she was. If her mother ever said to her, "Dearest darling daughter dear, would you please go to the shops and get us a loaf of bread for our supper tonight?" Well, she would look at her mother and she'd put on this face, you know, with that look, And then, shaking the head, she'd fold her arms, she'd stamp her foot and say, "Go yourself." If her mother ever said, "Dearest darling daughter dear, your room is very, very untidy. Would you please tidy it up?" The little girl would look at her mother and say, shaking her head and folding her arms and giving a look, stamping her foot, "I'll do it whenever I want and not when you tell me, so there." If her mother ever said, "Dearest darling daughter dear, it's getting very late. It's getting very dark and all the children have gone to bed. Please don't stay outside until late. You know we live in a forest, and in the forest there are creatures that would eat you very quickly." And the little girl would look at her mother and the head would go like this, and she'd put on that look, she'd fold her arms, stamp her foot and say, "I'll come in whenever I want, so there." Well, of course I know good children like yourselves, if you're listening, would never say or do anything like that to your mother. But I did say this child was extremely willful, naughty and rude. The strange thing was that her mother would just look at her and say, "One day, child, you will learn, and that day will come soon." And it did. And here's the way of it. She was standing outside her house. There wasn't much going on in the village as usual, but she was standing there looking up and down. Yeah, bored, 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 bored. But then her friend came up. She only had one friend. None of the good children would play with them. But her friend came running up and she was so excited. She was breathless. "You won't believe this, you won't believe this, you won't believe, you will not believe this." "What?" "No, you won't believe it." "What?" "You won't believe." "What? What will I not believe? Tell me." Her friend took a big breath in, shook her head. "Do you know that lane down by the side of your house?" "Aye." "Well, you know if you go down about half a mile, there's a bend in the lane?" "Yeah, that's where the old ruined cottage is." "It is no longer ruined. It's been fixed up. There's someone living in it. And the word on the street is, it's a witch, a wicked witch." No. Isn't that fantastic? The naughty girl said to her friend, "Why don't we go down and visit this wicked witch, and maybe she could teach us something nasty to do to those nice children who do what their mummies and daddies tell them." Her friend looked at her and went, "Nice idea. Wish I could fit it in, but I've people to see, places to go, things to do. Bye." And off she went. The naughty girl went inside her house, and her mother was standing there with her arms crossed and looked at her and said, "I heard all that. Now let me tell you something. Do not go anywhere near that witch. She is a wicked, evil creature who hates children and would mean harm to any child. Don't go near her." Well, the little girl looked at her mammy. The head started shaking. She got that look. She folded her arms, stamped her foot and said, "Whatever." That night, the little girl went to her room and waited for her mother to come up to bed. As soon as her mother was fast asleep, the little girl went down the stairs and went out of the door and down that lane, down that dark lane through the forest. and the moon shone high in the sky, bouncing over the clouds that were blown along by a strong wind. And the wind went through the forest, and all the leaves and all the trees in the forest rattled and shook and seemed to call out to the child, "Turn back, turn back." But the child wasn't listening. She came to the corner in the road, and there indeed was a light shining through a window. A very strange light. It wasn't the warmth and friendly light of a nice homely fire. It was dark and green. The little girl was intrigued and went up to the house and looked in through the window, and there she saw the most horrible creature. It wasn't the fact that it was an old crone with a big nose and dribbles and a witch's hat. No. The old crone was stirring a bubbling green stew in a pot. And from that witch's nose and eyes and ears there came a deep, dark green flame, the sign of a powerful witch. But no sooner had the child saw the witch than the witch saw the child and said, "Child, come now into my house. Come now, do as you are bid." And cast under a spell, the child had to do exactly as she was told for the first time in her life. She went into the house, and though she was screaming with terror inside, she had to do as she was bid. And she stood there terrified. The witch looked her up and down. "Children, I hate children. I'll make you useful. I'll turn you into a block of wood and burn you on my fire, for my bones are old and cold." And the witch then took out a wand and began to wave the wand to turn the child into a block of wood, when, bang! The door flung open, and there at the doorway was this creature, this beautiful angelic creature, shining brightly with love and strength and beauty and courage. And that beautiful creature called out, "Step away from that child. No more will you harm children. You have met your doom." And within a flash, just like that, that old witch was turned into a block of wood, and I believe she burned very well. The child, now out of her spell, rubbed her eyes and looked at the doorway. And there was her own dear mother. And her mother looked at her and said, "Well, child, will you continue to be naughty, or will you be obedient?" And the little girl looked at her mammy. "Mommy, I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. I'll never ever be cheeky again." And neither was she. So remember, children, whatever you do, never ever be cheeky to that person who brought you into the world, your own dear mother, for you never know what might happen if you are. Thank you.
Did you enjoy that storyteller? Of course you did. And if you enjoyed it, like the minstrels of old, we're passing around the hat. And if you have some, whether it's paper or coin, our storytellers would appreciate what you put in. Every penny you put in goes directly to that storyteller through paper. All you have to do is go to worldstorytellingcafe.com. Click on today's stories or click on that storyteller and there'll be a hat below the story. And you can just drop a little in that hat. Well, thank you for listening. And if you can afford it, we'd appreciate it.